In this section of the lecture, I'll be talking about a group of Asian economies known as the high-performing Asian economies. In the period from the mid-1960s to around about the mid-1990s, this group of countries was the most rapidly growing group of countries in the world. This is a graph which I used in the first section of this lecture, showing the performance, economic performance in GDP per capita of these high-performing Asian economies in the period from 1950 through to 2010. And you might remember that up the top we've got the economies of Singapore and Hong Kong and Japan, all of which began to grow pretty quickly after or around about 1950, and then grew at very strong rates during pretty much all of the period from around about 1960 onwards. We've got a second group of economies there, that's Taiwan and South Korea, which started on the path to growth a little bit later, but which, when they started growth, grew at a pretty similar rate to the first three countries when they'd been growing most rapidly. And then there were the other three economies of Malaysia, Singapore and Thailand, which again started to grow later than the first three countries. Haven't grown as rapidly as, for example, Taiwan and South Korea, but by historical standards have had growth performance that's been outstanding and notable. In this table, I've just sort of broken down that graph to tell you the average annual rate of growth in GDP per capita for 4 sub-periods from the data that was shown in the graph. And this just reinforces, in a way, the message about the growth experience of the different countries. You can see, for example, Japan and Hong Kong growing pretty quickly right from the start of the period, 1950 to 65, whereas, say, Malaysia, Indonesia and Thailand growing sort of less strongly at that period. Then, if we look at 1965 to 1980, we really see all of those economies growing very strongly. Singapore, which, although it was to become at the top of the tree in terms of level of GDP per capita amongst these countries, it actually had quite slow rate of growth from 1950 to 65 until independence, but then has the highest rate of growth in the period from 1965 to 1980. 80 to 95, you see basically the strong growth continuing in most of these economies, a little bit less than 65 to 80, but still very, very strong by international comparison. But you can see Japan, as we talked about in the last section of the lecture, its growth, having been sort of one of the early starters, is beginning to become less substantial during this period from 80 to 95. And then we have the period 95 to 2010, where again, by international standards, the growth of all these economies has remained strong. Japan, again, being the exception, having a slower growth rate than any of the other high-performing Asian economies. So the growth rate sort of definitely, again, a little bit slower sort of when you compare from the previous 15-year period, but that's partly explained by financial crisis, which we'll talk about in the next section of the lecture, and it also has to be noted, as I said, that these are very high growth rates by comparison with the rest of the world. So the general story is one of extremely high growth by historical standards of these countries by comparison with what was happening in the rest of the world. And within the whole period, some sort of pattern of evolution where, for example, Japan's growth is really strong at the start, becoming less strong at the end. Some countries growing pretty consistently strongly throughout the period, say South Korea, Even there, though, strongest growth sort of in the middle period. Other areas like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, where the growth's really sort of accelerating, and then not dropping off too much by comparison with what had been happening before. Now, in the rest of this section of the lecture, I'm not going to go through and try to talk about the individual details of all of these countries. That would take more time than I have for this section of the lecture. Instead, I want to use the experience of these high-performing Asian economies to talk about sort of two themes that I think are often prevalent in discussions of economic development today. Well, one of those themes is what I've called the shock of the new. And so when a new country or group of countries is observed to be growing strongly, it brings a lot of attention to that country. And there seems to generally be a lot of debate about what the causes of development in that country are. Not only that, but there often seems to be a search for what I've called here the X factor. It seems like often there's a search for the factor that this country has or this region has that other countries and regions don't have, as if we need this X factor to explain why this country or region could be growing so rapidly. And so I want to talk about the high-performing Asian economies in that context, and in particular to introduce that by talking about a debate that occurred over the roles of input accumulation and productivity growth in explaining economic development in this region. The other theme I want to take up is that I think it's the case that as we move sort of from the Industrial Revolution through to the present, and we think about sort of economic development, there's much more conscious attention to the role of government and public policy as a possible way to promote economic development. So when we have the experience of a group of economies like the high-performing Asian economies growing so rapidly, it brings a lot of attention to the question of, well, what role did government play? What role did public policy play in the development of these countries? Because of the idea that if you can understand that, then maybe that provides a recipe or guidelines for how government and public policy could assist other countries to grow. And so I'll say a little bit about one example of that debate which occurred for the high-performing Asian economies, which was to do with export promotion versus solving investment coordination problems as being the major aspect of policy in these countries that affected economic development. So starting out with the first issue of this idea of looking for an X factor that was driving economic development. So the way in which this search for an X factor was interpreted by economists was in terms of the extent to which economic growth could be explained by input accumulation versus productivity growth. So sources of economic growth in these high-performing Asian economies were seen as a way of understanding whether these Asian economies provided a new model for development. And so some research in the literature cast the debate in the following way. They said, well, look, if we look at this period of economic development and the sources of economic growth, and we find that most of that development was driven by increases in input accumulation, that is, say, larger amounts of capital per worker, larger amounts of the population working, a more educated workforce, then that tells us, look, there's nothing really new about these high-performing Asian economies. They're growing the way that other countries have grown. Versus if we looked at their experience and saw that a lot of the growth was coming from productivity growth, then maybe that would mean that there was some X factor that was driving productivity growth in these economies. Some studies came up with evidence that was interpreted as saying it's input accumulation that is the driver of, or the main driver of economic growth in the high-performing Asian economies. Other studies came up with findings that were interpreted as saying that rather it's productivity growth that is the main driver. Two examples. First of all, here's a quote from Paul Krugman, who in this article was summarising some research done by Alwyn Young. And Krugman says the miracle turns out to have been based on perspiration rather than inspiration, by which he's referring to Young's results, which suggested that the main driver or a very significant driver of economic growth in the high-performing Asian economies was in fact input accumulation, increasing proportion of the population in the workforce, high investment rates and capital accumulation. Versus, by comparison, here is a quote from Peter Klenow and Andres Rodriguez-Clare saying that we call for returning productivity differences to the centre of theorising about international differences in output worker. Their analysis having found results which suggested that it was productivity differences which were a big driver. In this table, I've included a summary of some of the results from both those studies that I just mentioned by Alwyn Young and Klenow and Rodriguez-Clare for the four high-performing Asian economies that their studies looked at. And so basically in this table, in this column, output per worker, this is the annual average rate of growth in output per worker in each of these four countries for the nominated years. Then here, this is Alwyn Young's study telling us how much of that, for example, 4.7 percentage points is explained by productivity growth. And he's saying, well, 3.7 percentage points is explained by productivity growth. Then we look at Klenow and Rodriguez-Clare, and they're saying, well, no, we think it's a little bit larger. 4.4 percentage points is explained, of the 4.7 is explained by productivity growth. And then you can look at the other rows in a similar way. And Singapore, for example, where Young had argued that not very much at all of the growth in output per worker was explained by productivity growth, Klenow and Rodriguez-Clare argue that a lot more was explained by productivity growth. But when you look at these numbers, it's not the case that either of the studies that I've chosen here is arguing that it's just productivity growth. So look at the case of South Korea, where both the studies agree on productivity growth, and it's saying that, look, the growth is about 50% of that 4.9 percentage points is explained by productivity growth, so the rest must be explained by input accumulation. So in a way, my interpretation of this debate was that it takes us back to the analysis of the determinants of economic growth, the division of that between input accumulation and labour productivity, factor productivity, that I talked about in the first lecture. So, in fact, I've reproduced a quote that I included in the section of the lecture on technology in the first lecture, saying that there's a broad consensus that differences in human capital account for about 10 to 30% of income differences, physical capital about 20%, and total factor productivity about 50 to 70%. If you look at the studies of the high-performing Asian economies, basically they broadly seem to be saying a similar thing, that there's a role for human capital, a role for physical capital, and a role for productivity. And so I think that tells us a couple of things. First of all, it tells us that both these factors were important in explaining economic growth. But secondly, to the extent that the experience of the high-performing Asian economies kind of broadly matches the experience of economic development of other countries, it tells us that there's no need to be looking for an X factor to explain economic development in these countries. And in fact, whether it's been driven by input accumulation or whether it's driven by total factor productivity, doesn't really tell us about the existence of some special factor driving economic development, because in fact the experience of other countries which have developed has been that it's been a mix of both. So to the extent that we look at these high-performing Asian economies and see that economic development is a mix of both, it tells us we can look for a relatively standard story to explain the economic development of these countries, that we don't need to be looking for an X factor to explain their economic development. So what does explain their economic development? Well, like this quote from World Bank report on the East Asian Miracle suggests, I think it was the standard factors that we've seen account for economic growth, for example, in the West in previous lectures. So the World Bank say that the high-performing Asian economies did three things. They had accumulation, so they invested in capital, they increased human capital, efficient allocation, so they allocated resources where they were going to be most productive, so away from agriculture and towards industry, and they were able to catch up rapidly technologically, so they had productivity improvement as well through implementing new technologies. They were assisted by initial conditions. So first of all, there was the distance to the leaders. So you might remember we've talked about before the idea that as we move later and later in history, the distance between countries that haven't had an extensive experience of economic development and the leaders is getting bigger and bigger, because over time the leaders are becoming more and more developed. So if you're not developing, the gap between a leader and a non-developer is getting bigger and bigger. And so that means that if a non-developer is able to start growing and developing, it has this large distance by which it can catch up, which means that it can grow, it has the scope to grow very rapidly because there's this large distance to catch up. So the large distance to the leaders is one element that we'd think of as explaining why the high-performing Asian economies were able to grow so rapidly after the 1950s and 60s. It also seems that to differing degrees, and certainly in the countries that grew most rapidly during this period, there was an initial socio-economic development position that was favourable to economic development. For example, a lot of these economies compared to other non-developed economies had populations that were relatively highly educated, and so were going to be able to move effectively to work in, to take up jobs in a growing industrial sector. There are other fundamentals as well. So high investment financed by domestic savings and openness to foreign technology. So for example, Singapore from the 1950s to the 1980s increases its the investment as a share of GDP from 10% to 40%. So this is a traditional type factor driving economic development. There's a country that is investing a lot in accumulating capital that's allowing it to move into areas of economic activity that have relatively high productivity. Also rapidly growing human capital. So if we take the example of Singapore again, Singapore from the 1950s to 1970s virtually doubles the proportion of its population who are in the workforce, from 25% to 50% through the demographic forces, for example, increasing the proportion of the population in workforce age, but also just increases in participation within age groups. And Singapore also rapidly increases human capital, so moves from a situation where after World War I, about half the population don't have any formal schooling, to a situation where by the 1970s over 2/3 have completed a primary school education. There's productivity growth in agriculture. Again, another feature that we've often seen in countries that are able to develop, that with productivity growth in agriculture allows you to shift workers from agriculture to industry while maintaining a food supply for the population, and to some extent to fund, if it's needed, purchases of foreign technology. There's also, especially in the latter period of economic development of these high-performing Asian economies, the scope for specialisation. So increasingly within Asia, intra-regional specialisation in the types of economic activities that countries are doing. Also, partly being driven by specialisation, partly being driven by the role of higher incomes, changing the type of activities in which these countries could specialise. So as they become higher income, higher wage countries, needing to move sort of up the value chain of manufacturing to produce sort of more complex manufacturing products that don't rely so much on cheap labour. This is a quote that I like from Jeffrey Frieden's book, Global Capitalism, just making the point about intra-regional specialisation and trade. He says the quintessentially American Barbie doll was by the middle of the 1990s a quintessentially global product. Taiwan and Japan supplied plastic and hair, Chinese firms provided cloth for dresses, and the dolls were assembled in Indonesia, Malaysia and China. So this is sort of, I guess, a micro kind of example of specialisation in production giving rise to intra-regional trade patterns. Another big issue was about policy. What was the policy that governments in these countries were maintaining during this period? Well, first of all, it seems important, and this takes us back to the discussion we had of Abramowitz's framework for catch-up and convergence when we talked about European economies after World War II. It's important that during this period there was a high degree of macroeconomic stability in these high-performing Asian economies. Governments also paid a lot of attention to income distribution. Here's a quote from the World Bank report on these economies that says that these countries needed institutions and mechanisms to reassure competing groups that each would benefit from growth. So, what's happening during this period is that these economies are taking a large proportion of national resources and investing them in, for example, your capital equipment. Individuals are investing their time in education, and that's only going to have a payoff in the future. So you're giving up something now for a payoff in the future. And so if you make that investment now, if you save more now to fund investment, if you acquire an education now to be more skilled later on, you want some confidence that you're going to earn a return on that when those investments pay off in the future. And so the World Bank argues that this was an important part of government policy in the high-performing Asian economies, creating conditions where populations could be assured that they would share in the benefits of growth. And that's not unlike the argument Eikengren makes about corporatist institutions in Western Europe after World War II, that these institutions were important in ensuring both businesses and workers that they would share in the future returns from investment activity. This wasn't the same corporatist approach, but it's a similar issue arising about economic growth in these high-performing Asian economies. Another important area of government policy was facilitating savings and to some degree directing investment, limiting distortions to resource allocation through the price system, making sure that there weren't distortions that pushed these countries away from their areas of comparative advantage is another theme of policy making that's often emphasised. What I want to do now is, having just talked a little bit about policy, move on to address in a more thoroughgoing way the second theme that I said I'd talk about, which is the issue of conscious attention to policy making becoming a more important part of studying the economic development experience of countries as we move towards the present, with the idea that you can learn from the policy experience of countries which have developed rapidly in a way that might assist you, might help you to assist other countries also who haven't developed in that way to begin to develop economically. And the way I want to do that here is through talking about briefly about a debate with regard to these high-performing Asian economies, which was about which was the most important way in which government intervened to promote exports or to promote investment strategies. And so, again, to draw from the World Bank report on these East Asian economies, this quote, I guess, sums up one of the prevailing viewpoints, which is that export push strategies have been by far the most successful combination of fundamentals and policy interventions. So what this is saying is, look, these high-performing Asian economies, something which governments did that was distinctive was that they directed resources towards industry sectors where they thought they could be successful in exporting, or they took steps to seek to promote exporting activity amongst the industry sectors, the modern industry sectors, manufacturing industry sectors that were developing. And so the idea underlying this sort of as a basis for policy was that, well, you know, look, if you want to produce on a large scale, if you want to get economies of a scale from being as a manufacturing producer, then an important part of that, of opening up a larger market to our producers, is going to be exporting. Now, a lot of these high-performing Asian economies have very large domestic populations, but starting from a low base in terms of their available incomes to spend on the manufactured goods that were being produced. So the idea is, look, to really be able to sell to a market on a sufficiently large scale to be an efficient, competitive producer of these manufacturing goods, there needed to be an export market. And so government strategies in these countries to open up, to push companies towards exporting were an important part of their development experience. The contrary view is has been put probably most forcefully by the Harvard development economist Dani Rodrik, and he says a much more plausible explanation for economic takeoff is the sharp increase in investment demand that took place in the early 1960s. So Rodrik has a couple of arguments. He argues that, look, if you look for a lot of these countries at the data, it really seems that they begin to take off as exporters at a time when the government's not actually doing that much in terms of changing incentives to export. So the timing in terms of incentives to export and exports taking off isn't right. Rodrik also sort of questions the causality of thinking that export push strategies would initiate a boom in investment. He argues instead that it's a boom in investment that will, through a variety of channels, end up stimulating international trade. So, for example, if you're going to invest in capital equipment, you may need to be buying that from foreign suppliers, which means you need to be importing, and which then means that you would want to be trying to export more to pay for those imports. So rather, the causality is from a country being an investor trying to accumulate capital, driving it towards being more engaged in the international economy. And Rodrik has a theoretical rationale for why the role of government in promoting investment activity was so important in these economies. And it's an idea that, broadly thought of, has quite a long tradition in thinking about developing economies. It's an idea that's often called big push industrialization. It's the idea that government needs to intervene in the economy to try and solve a coordination problem that would otherwise exist in getting several sectors of the economy that need to begin developing simultaneously for development to occur to get that simultaneous development of those sectors occurring. And so Roderick here says, because of scale economies, that is the idea that as you produce more, average cost of production become cheaper, only a large-scale movement of resources is guaranteed to be profitable. So he's saying, look, if you can produce on a large enough scale, it's going to push your costs down in a way that may make you profitable. But maybe it's only if you're doing that large-scale production that you get your costs low enough to be profitable. So you've got to enter to become a producer in a new sort of industrial sector, say, on a large scale. But Roderick says, from the perspective of an individual entrepreneur, say, thinking about whether to set up a business, you might only be willing to do that if others are investing in a similar way. So you might be thinking of setting up as a transport equipment manufacturer, but you're only going to be willing to do that if you think you can get cheap supplies of steel and cheap supplies of components that are going to go into making the trains, for example, you might be thinking of manufacturing. But if you're thinking of becoming a steel producer, you face a similar problem, that you're only going to be willing to begin producing steel if you think that there's someone who's going to be able to or want to buy that steel from you. So it may be that there's a profitable opportunity for producing steel and a profitable opportunity for producing transport equipment, but neither of those businesses will get started unless each entrepreneur who's going to set up each of those businesses is confident that the other business will start at the same time, so that if you're the transport equipment, you can get steel. If you're the steel, you've got someone to sell to. And so the idea is that the individual investors by themselves may not be able to solve the problem of starting both businesses simultaneously. So instead, you need government to come in and give a push to both businesses starting at the same time to solve the coordination problem that would otherwise exist. So, as I said, a second theme of thinking about economic development has been this increased attention to economic policy making, and that debate has generally played out in terms of, well, what policies was it that this country or group of country used that mean they developed so rapidly? In the case of the high-performing Asian economies, the debate, as I've described, has been about the role of export push strategies versus big push coordination, investment promotion strategies as being the source of economic development. In the next section of the lecture, I'll go on to talk about a period or periods when growth slowed in these high-performing Asian economies.